Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And here's Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hi, Geoff.
Good morning.
In another salubrious cafe, becoming routine.
I work hard, guys. Cafes are my life.
This cafe culture. Andy Maciver was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello, good morning.
In a plush hotel this morning.
Yeah, that's the difference. That's the difference right there.
That is the difference. That is the difference, Jeffrey. What can I say? Avocado smoothie for breakfast, hotel for podcast,
Speaking to real people, and you're in plush Edinburgh hotels. Tells you everything you need to know, listeners.
Right, well, there we are. Thank you so much for finding this Bourgeoisie podcast. Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe, stick around, and thank you very much for finding us. If you are new here as a result of hearing Adam Bolton or watching Adam Bolton dissecting the local elections in England before they'd even happened, then welcome. We know there are lots of you who have found the podcast through Adam Bolton's brilliant video, which is still on our YouTube channel, of course. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and you'll get our new episodes every single week. On the podcast today then, lots of our subjects will probably sort of cross over, but things that you'll hear about: the programme for government, which has been delivered early by the First Minister, marking a year to go until the Scottish parliamentary election. So what did the programme for government tell us, and what can we expect now about the election campaign? We'll also mention the fact that just hours before that, Nicola Sturgeon spoke publicly for the first time about the Supreme Court ruling on the legal definition of a woman being based on biological sex. We'll discuss that on the pod as well. Of course, you can watch our episodes on YouTube. Just search for Holyrood Sources. You can find us on X, you can watch clips on TikTok, and subscribe to our mailing list at holyroodsources.com. And actually, I'm going to start with a couple of your WhatsApp messages today. You can send these anytime. The number is 0333 404 6507. First of all, some praise for Andy Maciver from Peter on WhatsApp after last week's episode. Peter says, Andy's point about the wealth which could come from renewables and associated attitude towards fossil fuels now, I think he's spot on. I was the Green candidate for Inverness, Skye and West Rossshire at the last election. However, we can't achieve any of this without independence, says Peter. In fact, I've now moved to the SNP because the UK government is not and does not understand Scotland or how to best make use of our natural competitive advantage. We'll never reach our potential while shackled to a dying, flailing system which doesn't listen to us. Andy, do you want to respond to that?
Listen, Peter, as if I don't have enough unionist trolls on Twitter. I can't respond to your independence point. No, that was very kind of you, Peter. Thank you. I think the energy arguments that I made last week, in which my colleague Jeffrey has also persistently made over a long period of time, apply whether it is an independent Scotland or Scotland in the UK. Both are equally viable, and the energy arguments apply to both. How's that? Did I get out of that nicely?
I think you did okay there, actually.
Yeah, all right,
fair.
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
I always in my mind, when I read that message, my immediate thought was on John Curtis, who joined us just after the new year to discuss the polling that we did. And he said the 2026 election is going to be a blame election. And I can't help but feel that energy policy might be a big part of governments blaming each other for not advancing the case on renewables more efficiently. And then we'll talk a bit more about a year to go in a second, of course. And just another point from Leo, who got in touch on WhatsApp, who just says, I'm a Scot living down in London. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. I've actually seen Calum Macdonald, that's me, working away in the atrium of Portcullis House, but didn't want to disturb him by saying the above in person. Come on over any time. I'm never working that hard, believe me. Leo says, I was slightly surprised that on your episode, when talking about Tony Blair's comments on net zero, you didn't bring up the Tony Blair Institute's work with petrol states and thus Blair's obvious conflict of interest. It doesn't make his argument invalid, but I think it's something that should caveat his comments, says Leo. Fair. We've now included that. Right, let's go on to discuss the programme for government. A couple of announcements here, taking the headlines. The First Minister, John Swinney, to combat the 8 a.m. appointment lottery, he's announced that NHS Scotland will provide an additional 100,000 GP surgery appointments in the coming year. I think the other headline grabber, peak time rail fares will also be scrapped for good. Geoff, the programme for government was early. Have you been able to sort of work out what the point in it was? Is it something of a manifesto that's kind of been loosely written by the SNP at this point?
No, I mean, it wasn't particularly setting the heather alight, was it? I mean, some good announcements there. You just mentioned them. I thought the also the alcohol bans to be lifted on trains, which I think was a daily record campaign. So there'll be some populist welcome of that. It was decent. I thought the reason he was moving it forward is because he had something to tell us, like a real policy change in direction or something. It was not really that. I think it was just to try and grab the airwaves post the local elections, which I'm sure his advisors understood was going to be a big win for reform, and he wanted to hammer the point that Scotland and the Scottish Government is actually delivering. I thought the 100,000 GP things is a nice announcement. It's a nice number, and it's carried some papers today. So, from a comms perspective, that's done pretty well. But actually delving into the figures, it's not scratching the surface, really, in terms of the scale of the problem. So overall, decent, not particularly great, I would have thought. I mean, I don't think we're going to be talking about this programme for government for years to come.
Yeah. Andy, did you feel it was kind of an election? I'm trying to establish what it is, because one of the other observations, and this is on STV News, is that both of these things we've already mentioned, GP appointments and peak time rail fares being scrapped, immediately the Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar said that the SNP had nicked these policies from Scottish Labour, commitments that they'd already made.
And fine, I suppose, that he says that. Ultimately, that's not really going to cut the mustard in terms of an election message. Of course, governments get the credit for what goes well, and they get the blame for what doesn't go well. I don't think anybody in the history of elections has said that policy there was actually a policy from this lot when they were in opposition, so I'll vote for them instead. I thought the programme for government was just very safe, to be honest. I thought would be the obvious word I would use to describe it. It was just safe, you can tell now, I think, that the SNP feel that they are further ahead than they thought they were going to be. I think you can tell that they feel pretty comfortable with the position that they're in. And they don't need to push it electorally. Now, for those of us who want to see a more radical agenda and who want to see, more action to fix some of the big things that are wrong, probably isn't, there's probably not much for folk like that in there, to be honest. But in terms of just keeping things steady to win an election, it's probably did exactly what it needs to do. This is what happens when you have no opposition that can beat you, not just in politics, but in sport, in life. If you're so far ahead that you don't really need to worry, then you don't really get pushed to do anything particularly good. And, I think if you look back this time last year, or just after the election, the general election last year, I think you saw a spate of quite enthusiastic, action-based stuff from the Scottish Government. I wonder if over the next year or so that just becomes a much safer play, where they just say, steady as you go, everything's all right. Look at the explosion that's happening in England. Much better off up here. Everything's fine. Carry on.
Andy's analysis is spot on, but I think the SNP should be very careful. This is not a population that's going to the polls or thinking about voting SNP because they think the SNP is wonderful and done great. This is because they're not the Labour Party, they're not the Conservatives, and they're not Reform. Simple as that. If Andy's analysis is right, and I suspect it is, then that's really dispiriting, because I think they should be pushing the envelope. Now's the time to be bold and prove why you should be in the lead in the polls and why you are deserving of becoming the next Scottish Government. So I feel that it's a bit dispiriting if that is exactly what's happening.
It brings me on to this question from Rory, who says, long-time listener to the podcast. Thank you, Rory, for your kind message. Anyway, he goes on, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on whether John Swinney will still have another reshuffle before the Holyrood election next year. With senior names in cabinet, Fiona Hislop, Shora Robson, Mary Goodgeon, all standing down before 2026, it would seem strange to go into the election campaign with them still in their positions. Surely the FM wants to present the public with the cabinet that he will have in place should the SNP win in 2026. However, with the programme for government having been brought forward, do you think that the current cabinet will be kept in their positions in order to see this programme through and avoid any delays to progress as a result of ministerial turnover? Asks Rory from Edinburgh. Geoff, your take on that?
It's a very good question, and actually I hadn't considered that. I'd always assumed it would be a reshuffle for the very reasons that he outlines. But perhaps John he's a safety first kind of politician. He is more managerial in his style, and He doesn't like upsetting the apple cart and try and keep the party together, which is no mean feat given what they've been through in recent years. But I think he should do a reshuffle, and I think if I was to put a bet on it, I think it still favours there being a reshuffle pretty soon, because as our Stuart, I think it was, who said, you want to present the population with the team that you think can deliver what Scotland needs. So I think he should do it.
The question from Rory. Andy, what's your take on it?
Rory Stewart, yeah.
I am still of the view that he will, because I think, 1/3 of the cabinet and I think a similar proportion of ministers are not standing, and I do think there is a certain credibility gap there when you go into an election with a cabinet, a large proportion of whom are not intending to stand. So my view is still that he will do it, and I also still wonder, as I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, whether or not he will reduce the number of people in cabinet and make it a more focused, policy-driven cabinet ahead of an election. I suppose the caveat that I would give to both mine and Geoff's views are that ultimately the faces of this election for the SNP will be John Swinney and Kate Forbes, and it won't go much beyond that. So it may be that John and his advisors are sitting there saying, actually, ultimately, if we go into this election with 3 or 4 members of cabinet who are not standing, is it actually going to shift a single vote? Does anybody actually care about that? The answer is probably no. And so I just wonder if there's that kind of 25% chance at the back of their minds where they say, this is ultimately about John and Kate. It's the John and Kate show. Doesn't really matter who else is behind them. It's the John and Kate show. So why bother taking the risk of putting a bunch of ministers and cabinet secretaries out of the tent, risking them potentially saying things they shouldn't say ahead of an election? Let's just keep it as it is. I don't think that'll happen. I think there will be a reshuffle, but I think we have to recognise that as a potential minority chance if they decide that's the way they want to go.
We asked on X this morning, what did you make of John Swinney's early programme for government? Fraser said, I thought it showed a strong, clear political direction, something Labour is lacking at the moment. The battle lines are now being drawn for 2026. The SNP know if they can stay on side against Labour's UK policies. He mentions winter fuel. They're likely to win next year. John says, I really am fatigued by this government, but I really love your podcast, so I won't say anything because I have nothing nice to say about John Swinney or the SNP. This person, who's called Sticks and Stones, says, lifting the alcohol ban on trains has basically led the country to independence. There's an interesting thought there, actually. I caught this from Professor James Mitchell of Edinburgh University in the Herald on Sunday, who Geoff was saying that actually John Swinney's lack of progress on achieving the goal of independence could mean he faces something of a backlash from within his own party. Now, I don't know if that's what Sticks and Stones on X meant to, inspire, but there is a conversation to be had, isn't there, about where John Swinney is on independence?
Absolutely. I've not heard John Swinney talk about his plans for independence anytime recently. But it's not tenable for a leader of the SNP to go into an election without a policy and a strategy on independence. So that is going to have to come pretty soon. There's no doubt. I thought it was quite interesting what Andy just said there, actually, about some ministers not wanting to upset the apple cart in advance of the election. People need to remember that when you pose in any poll, it's backed up in the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, on all the metrics the Scottish Government is responsible for, be it education, be it health, be it raising living standards, all the rest of it, they've got net negative ratings. Net negative ratings. Now, this is modesty forbids me from saying, in fact, no, it doesn't. I'm going to say it. When I was in government, almost all those metrics were positive all the time. So this is not a strong platform to go into an election with. And so I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier. He should be being bold. There should be conviction behind what he's doing. And he should come up with some policies that really will transform Scotland, or at least seek to transform Scotland and capture the imagination of an electorate, which, quite frankly, is scunnered with all of politics just now.
Andy, do you feel like there is a a feeling of discontent within the SNP when it comes to independence, that there's a bit of a dead end, that nobody can quite work out what the way through is, and that John Swinney isn't speaking enough about it?
Well, look, of course some of them will be. Because the SNP has always been populated by a spectrum of opinion on independence, from those who are incrementalists, obviously, and those who want to be a bit more fundamentalist about it. So clearly those who are more on the fundamentalist side will think, why is he not banging on about this all the time? Especially because of what's happening with Farage, and we'll maybe talk about that in a second, because it is relevant here. Ultimately, though, I think that John Swinney is from the school of thought that I happen to agree with strategically, that the way to foment support for independence is to run devolution well. And you can tell from the polling that we did earlier in the year and from other polling that has been done that John Swinney is the most popular, or if you would rather, the least unpopular leader in the country. By some distance. And the performance of the Scottish Government, although they are not a popular government as such, they are seen as being much more capable than anybody else of running the Scottish Government. And that is what they need to do. This is what history tells us right back to the Salmond era, is that the way to increase support for independence is to be competent at running devolution. And I think that is simply the Swinney tactic. Let's not forget, the support for independence was at 45% 11 years ago. It is now somewhere between 47 and 48%. So yes, it's higher. But it's nowhere near where independent supporters should want it to be if they want to be sure they're actually going to win. If you want to win a referendum on independence, you need your support to be consistently up at 60-odd%. Only then can you say to yourself, right, this is definitely it. It's definitely going to happen this time. I just don't think they are anywhere remotely close to that sort of level.
Yeah. A couple of other responses on X. What did you make of John Swinney's early programme for government? Caroline says, jaded, unimaginative, lacking substance. And Jeannie said, ask Nicola, #sabotage. So that brings us on to Nicola Sturgeon, the ex-SNP leader, and of course former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who spoke for the first time about that landmark Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a woman. This happened in the Scottish Parliament just hours before John Swinney delivered his programme for government. Here's a bit of what Nicola Sturgeon said.
The question for me, and I think for a lot of people, is how that is now translated into practice. Can that be done in a way that, of course, protects women, but also allows trans people to live their lives with dignity and in a safe and accepted way? I think that remains to be seen. I think some of the early indications would raise concerns in my mind that we are at risk of making the lives of trans people almost unlivable, and I don't think the majority of people in the country would want to see that. It certainly doesn't make a single woman any safer to do that, because the threat to women, as I think we all know, comes from predatory and abusive men. So that's my view.
Andy, I want to come to you first on this, because you were there, weren't you? You were in the garden lobby at the Scottish Parliament when Nicola Sturgeon appeared and spoke to reporters. Now, she did speak to them for, 6-7 minutes or so. Obviously, we've played 50 seconds, but I think that gets the thrust of her view across. What happened? What did you see happen in front of you?
Well, I was in Parliament yesterday. I have a client doing an exhibition there this week. So slightly accidentally, I actually walked down the stairs from the members' lobby up near the chamber of the Parliament down to the garden lobby to grab a coffee, actually. And that's where, for those listeners who don't know the parliamentary layout, the garden lobby is where a lot of reporters hang about for exactly this potential sort of opportunity that might come along. And Nicola Sturgeon was there. There was a bit of a scrum. I unfortunately managed to find myself in camera shot, so I can assure any listeners that I wasn't directly involved in this situation. I was just an innocent. I was an innocent bystander on the television last night. It was an interesting one, guys, because as Geoff will know, knowing that building very well, you don't have to be seen if you don't want to be seen. And by Nicola Sturgeon placing herself in the garden lobby, there was only one outcome to that. It was the first opportunity since the Supreme Court ruling that the journalists would have had to have a media scrum, as they call it, with her. and they certainly took that opportunity, and she engaged in that. So whilst it wasn't necessarily pre-planned, I think it would have been expected by Nicola when she turned up in the garden lobby. So it was an interesting one. I wondered for a while if it might steal the coverage of the day, to be honest, ahead of PFG. I think probably it's fair to say it didn't steal the coverage, but it has shared the coverage of that day. So interesting timing.
Yeah, interesting timing. Geoff, what do you make of it?
Yeah, well, I've been in government. I was in government 7 years. I think we did 7 of them by definition, programme for governments. And it's one of the few set-piece opportunities that a government gets to set out its agenda for the year ahead. And I've been quite impressed, actually. One thing that, just as an advisor, perhaps people don't notice this, but there's been quite a good execution of social media and different interventions in advance and during and after some of the set-piece events John Swinney's doing just now. And that programme for government was no different. He was in the Heineken brewery the day before. There were some other social posts going on ahead. And I think that there was clearly a comms grid that was effectively executed for the programme for government, just to amplify and maximise the coverage. What was not in that comms grid was Nicola Sturgeon breaking cover after many weeks to talk about gender. And I think it was quite outrageous, actually. And I'm quite disappointed. And I'm sure that John Swinney's advisors are hugely disappointed. To Andy's point earlier, Nicola Sturgeon said, look, guys, it's a programme for government today. It's John Swinney's big day. Let's do a huddle tomorrow and I'll chat to you about it. Equally, she could have done something beforehand and arranged it. She knew exactly what she was doing by going through the garden lobby, and she knew people would want to know her views because she hadn't spoken about that. And she took away from John's big speech, set-piece speech. And for that, I bet you John Swinney's pretty angry about it. Now, if people think I'm being too hard on Nicola here, imagine for a second on Nicola Sturgeon's second programme for government, that Alex Salmond swanned into the Parliament and started speaking to the press about a controversial issue or a major issue of the day. Would she be angry? Yes, she would, and she'd be right to be angry. So I thought it was a very unfortunate from Nicola Sturgeon, and I wish she hadn't done it, actually.
Thanks, both. I think that just about boxes off programme for government. But I do want to consider the 1 year to go to the election. I don't know, it's not an anniversary. What is it when it's a year to go? A year before? I'm not very sure. Anyway, today, almost all the political leaders in Scotland, including the First Minister, including the Scottish Conservative leader, Russell Finley, including Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar, and Scottish Liberal Democrat leader, Alex Cole-Hamilton, will be making speeches to mark the occasion. Now, we are recording before these speeches actually happen. So I think what we should do is try to predict what you'll hear from each leader. You can then listen to them, and we'll regroup next week to see if Geoff and Andy got it right. Okay, so let's start with the First Minister, John Swinney, and just pull out a couple of bullet points, what we're going to hear from each leader. Do you think? What do you expect to hear from the First Minister? Geoff?
Only the SNP can be trusted to stand up for Scotland's interests.
Andy, would you like to go for a bullet point on Swinney?
Well, I have to have a different bullet point, don't I? Because
Probably,
Geoff's
yeah.
got that bullet point, so it doesn't really work if I then choose the same bullet point. I mean, Geoff is right, though. That is the overarching message. I think the other thing that I would add to it, since I need a different bullet point, is if there's one policy area where there will be more focus than anything else, it'll be the NHS. Partly because he knows it polls well, and partly because he knows that's exactly what Anas Sarwar will also go on as well. Nice segue, Calum. I hope you appreciate that segue into Anas Sarwar.
Well, yeah, why don't we stick with you, Andy? What's Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, going to say today?
I think he'll say that the SNP have already had their chance over the last 20 years on the NHS and they flunked it.
Geoff?
The SNP cannot be trusted to stand up for Scotland's interests.
Next, let's go to the Scottish Conservative leader, Russell Finley. I feel like Andy should go first on this. Andy, what speech would you be writing for Russell Finley today?
That's an interesting concept. They're kind of in this part movement away from only talking about Indie Ref 2, because there's a kind of general acceptance, as we know from when we did the hustings and the leadership campaign, that they think they have to offer something else. I don't think they've quite pivoted away from that entirely yet. So I think they will talk about the divisions of nationalism and the requirement to focus on issues. And I imagine that of those issues that will be talked about the most, I would think you'll hear the word gender mentioned a lot. And then probably also stuff on tax as well.
Okay, Geoff?
Don't vote for reform because we're the Scottish Conservatives.
That is inspiring, uplifting even, as a political message, and so beautifully delivered as well. Right,
this is Geoff is not none of Geoff's messages are a great electoral sell. I wouldn't suggest. I don't think any of the parties will rush to take Geoff's straplines and put them on Twitter or on leaflets. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I don't know. Maybe it's in the delivery. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, it is in the delivery. Are you feeling a little uninspired, Geoff, by what the political...
No, there's no way Geoff's not uninspired. Geoff is enthused by what he sees in front of him in Scottish politics.
Let's get to the end, and I'll give you a bit more.
You talk about, Geoff.
Yeah.
Right,
hurry up.
Okay. Let's go on to the Scottish Liberal Democrat leader, Alex Cole-Hamilton. We'll come to Liberal Democrat strategist and party member, Andy Maciver, in a second. Geoff, you go first. What can Alex Cole-Hamilton say today?
For the Liberal Democrats, we actually do exist.
Andy?
I think that he, in fact, not to play into what you just said earlier on, Calum, but I think that Alex has... probably got one of the more nuanced jobs to do, actually, because there's a little bit of criticism has to be given, obviously, of the SNP and its record. But he will clearly have one eye on the budget coming up later this year, and then another eye on the election, because of all the opposition parties, of all the unionist opposition parties, there is actually a chance that there will be some co-working. So I think his speech is likely to be probably the most... welcoming, I suppose, and potentially go and edit this, Calum, because I can't remember the word I was trying to say.
It's all right. Did we have an Go on.
I think his speech, let's go with this. So I think his speech will probably be the most open of the unionist speeches, given what he knows might be coming around the corner.
Okay, good. Geoff, are you, I mean, overall, Geoff, and there is a serious point in all of this, are you feeling somewhat uninspired by what these political party leaders are going to offer for 2026?
No, I mean, if you go back and listen to what I said, essentially that is what the speeches will be seeking to convey. Okay, that's not the strap line, but that's exactly what they're seeking to convey. The SNP, we know when... Again, I'm talking about the social attitude survey, any bit of polling, when you challenge the question, who do you trust to stand up for Scotland's interests? It's always the SNP. Regardless of how rubbish they may be doing in the public's eyes in terms of their own governance, that always happens. Anna Sarwar's got to try and attack that mantra. He's got to say, no, you're not good in government and it's time for a change. Problem for him, as Andy's outlined, is that the change that the UK government is showing so far isn't particularly appealing. And Russell Finley's got to try and find a way to stop people from voting for reform and vote for him instead. And the Liberal Democrats, quite frankly, just need profile raising, because apart from 5 constituency, nobody really knows that they're there and what their core offer is. So there is a genuine thread to what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, fair. Good, thank you. Good explanation. Just as a final conversation then, by the way, do have a listen. Get in touch as well as you listen to the political parties and leaders and their speeches today. And as I say, we'll regroup next week and just see how on the button these two managed to predict what they were going to say. You can WhatsApp us, of course, 0333 404 6507 or email hello@holyroodsources.com. And yeah, just want to spend a few minutes reflecting on something Neil Mackay wrote in the Herald just in the last couple of days. He said that the Labour and Tory duopoly on British power has shuddered and given way as reform emerges as the main opposition to Sir Keir Starmer in the wake of the English elections. The rise of reform's virulent form of English nationalism, however, endangers one political pillar more than all others: the Union. It's always been a challenge for traditional Scottish Unionists to understand a key truth about the Union. What happens in England has more bearing on its safety and security than what happens in Scotland. Andy, I think I'll throw it to you first, as just to give us a broad thought on, I suppose, the top line. English nationalism will be the death of the Union, is the headline on the article. What do you think of that?
Well, there is validity in the thought, and it isn't a new thought. I actually remember way back in the day when I was in Parliament working for David McCletchie. David McCletchie was always worried about that. He always used to talk about, privately to us at least, he always used to talk about English nationalism in the context of, him being of the view that at some point the English would realise that they're the only ones who don't have their own parliament and so on, and would start to, and the Barnett formula and all that sort of stuff, and would start to say, hold on a minute, I'm not really too sure about this. So I suppose that's one side of the balance sheet here, is that the concept is sound, I think, and it is a possibility. I think the other side of the balance sheet, though, is that there's not Nigel Farage is an English nationalist. And I think that at some point, if he's in a position of power, then English nationalism may become more of a thing. But I don't think he's campaigning as an English nationalist at the moment. He's campaigning as a populist in the same way as others all over the world are. So I don't really think that English nationalism is a massive issue as we speak. But I do acknowledge that at some point in future, it may become something.
Geoff?
Yeah, can I just tell you, I was listening to Andy speak there. I always remember when we were down in London, particularly, and we were doing the press calls down there in the run-up to the referendum, and perhaps less not educated or rehearsed, to be fair, journalists down there were asking, well, what would happen to the rest of the UK, and what would that mean for Westminster if Scotland became independent? And Alec had this great quip. He said, I'm pretty confident that the great people of England and their politicians are more than capable of having their own parliament. And I just love that, it was just a fantastic way of doing it. You could just see their faces going, oh yeah, get up. So no, look, Nigel Farage, nationalist sentiment tinges everything that he says and does. There's no doubt about that, but that's not fundamentally why we're seeing the rise of reform. The rise of reform is because of antipathy towards the Labour Party. A year ago, reform got 14%, a very healthy result in the UK general election. But had Labour performed better and people were more enthused about this new government, then I just don't think that rise happens. And what we saw last Thursday happens. And this is all down to trust. It's down to trust. And Labour pledged a lot of things in the election. Some things they didn't pledge and they've done surprising things like national insurance contributions, things like the winter fuel payment, for example. And so effectively this is all about trust. And had the Labour Party in government won the trust over the people, we would not have seen the same rise of reform. And incidentally, you would not have seen the kind of resuscitation of the SNP north of the border either.
Mm. What do you make, Andy, of John Swinney's messaging in the last couple of weeks? He's worried about what would happen if Reform UK formed a government at Westminster, if Nigel Farage became Prime Minister. This kind of idea of feeling a little intimidated by the rise of Reform, perhaps, in his messaging.
I'm not sure if it's as much. I'm not sure if the messaging, well, what the messaging is designed to say. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's designed to say it's intimidating or not. I think Nigel Farage is a massive campaign gift for the SNP. I mean, that is true. I think the interesting thing about the SNP messaging over the last few days since the local elections is that it does, and I mentioned this earlier in relation to nationalism. Be interested to know what direction Geoff thinks this will go in, because over the last year of Swinney and Forbes, we have had this more incrementalist approach. It's been policy heavy in terms of what they've been saying, and it's been very light on independence. But what they've been doing over the last few days, especially on social media, is going very heavy again on independence. It's going, who do you want to choose your future? Do you want Scotland? Do you want to choose your own future, or do you want Farage to choose it for you? So to me, those two messages seem to be opposed. And it doesn't mean you can't send out mixed messages during a campaign, especially if you're trying to attract different audiences. But to me, those are different messages. And I wonder if the temptation of going heavy on, it should be Scotland's choice, not Farage's choice, is just too delicious a prospect for John Swinney to miss because of what's happening in England.
Yeah, I think there's something in what you say there, Andy, and I'm just kind of waiting, trying for Nigel Farage to say something like that. I mean, Nigel's promised to come up to Scotland and campaign heavily. And he's going to have to talk about this issue. And I think that'll be the fodder that John Swinney and Kate Forbes need to start maybe the drumbeat towards their policy of independence. But they're going to have a decent policy, because I think there is an element of the movement, the nationalist movement, that's getting a bit scunnered at themselves with the lack of progress as they see it. Can I just say one other thing? And it kind of ties into what I was saying earlier about the programme for government and the kind of lack of boldness, in the sense that there's a bit of safety about the SNP, as Andy alluded to. You know, I've been in and around a lot of the country recently. I was up in Fraserburgh, Peterhead last week, speaking to a lot of folk. I was in a pub for a couple of hours, and look, okay, it's all anecdotal. I can see a healthy reform vote unless there is a compelling alternative. And I mean that. Now, enough to win a constituency? Maybe, maybe not. But, you know, I was up in Murray. I've been down in the Borders in the last week, and there's some folks saying, okay, it's in the aftermath and the glow of reform's win, and that's always a pretty good moment for a party that's emerged victorious. But I just feel that the SNP can't be complacent. No party can be complacent in trying to address what will be a significant challenge in Scotland. It will be a significant challenge to all parties, namely the Tories and the Labour Party. But the SNP can't sit there and think this is great for us. You need to be bold. You need to have a compelling vision, because elections are funny beasts, and who knows what can happen on polling day.
Can I just add to that as well? Is about 3 or 4 months ago now, we had Thomas Kerr on the podcast, the now Reform councillor, presumably going to become Reform candidate in Glasgow, former Tory leading light in Glasgow. And before that, we had Martin Green. And Martin Green, I think, if I remember rightly, was very clear about their policy when I asked him on retaining the Scottish Parliament and making it better. I don't think that issue's over yet. Let me just say that. I still would not be surprised if Reform, in terms of their policy platform, are talking about whether or not devolution should be scrapped. Now, I think in terms of how John Swinney and Kate Forbes respond to that as part of the SNP campaign, that's quite material. And I think if Reform do come out with a policy saying devolution should go, then that may change the game quite significantly in terms of how the SNP respond to that in a policy sense.
1 year to go till the Scottish parliamentary election. Of course, Holyrood Sources takes you inside politics every single week. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for listening, and we will drop into your podcast feed again next week. Hit us up on YouTube if you'd like to watch these podcasts, of course. Find us on X, keep in touch on email and on WhatsApp, and we'll talk to you again next week.